The United States houses more human beings in prisons than any other country in the world. This is true whether you're counting total numbers or in relation to population size. While there are several competing theories, a look at the data reveals that a significant part of the prison growth in the last 40 years has been driven by the war on drugs. Here's the data. By 1980, there were over 315,000 prisoners in state and federal facilities. 57% were violent offenders, 30% were property violators such as thieves or those convicted of fraud. 5.5% of inmates were in for public order and other miscellaneous offenses. And the remaining 7.5% were non-violent drug law violators. 10 years later, the drug war had grown, and the total American prison population had more than doubled to over 740,000 inmates. The proportion of offenders in each type of crime had also changed dramatically. The most growth occurred in the non-violent drug offender population, which grew to a significant 24%. From 1990 to 2000, the drug-driven population growth continued. By 2000, the total prison population had almost doubled again to over 1.3 million inmates. And by 2010, the prison population was up to 1.6 million people. The growth has started to settle and even decline in recent years, but the proportions of offenses are retaining their post-1990 levels. America's unique methods of enforcing drug prohibition seem to parallel its unique prison population. And one has to ask, is our country really better off with so many non-violent drug offenders behind bars? Are drug users likely to be cured from addiction by being locked up? Has locking up dealers and users lessened the demand for drugs?
In the 70s, a research experiment found that when a rat is put in an empty cage, all alone with 2 water bottles, one normal and one drugged, it gets addicted to the drugged water and eventually dies of malnutrition. The experiment was seen as proof that drugs are uncontrollable, and it laid the foundation for 40 years of drug policy, with strict laws, rehab centers that focused on withdrawal, and a massive war on drugs, making it clear that drugs are bad. What most people don't know is that in the same decade, another scientist, Professor Bruce Alexander, thought it was obvious that lonely rats in boring cages would choose drugs over water. So he put them in a rat park, a lush cage with friends and everything a rat could want, while still having free access to drugs. Surprisingly, his rats chose not to use the drugs. The researcher even took the study one step further and had the rats use drugs for 57 days in the lonely cage until they became heavily addicted, and then placed them in the rat park. Astonishingly, the rats gradually reduced their drug use until they stopped using them altogether and lived the rest of their lives drug-free. Experiments like these happen to humans all the time. One example is in hospitals, where heavily injured patients are given a medical form of heroin. This heroin is much stronger than the heroin used by street addicts. Despite months of use, these medical users just stop when they go home to a life where they are surrounded by a loving family. The same drug, used for the same length of time, turns street users who were alone and unhappy into desperate addicts. The rat park experiments didn't show that chemical addictions don't exist, but it showed that they are not the only thing that matters in drug abuse. Maybe a person's access to a functioning social life and a lush cage are even more important than continuing the war on drugs mission of making drugs unavailable and penalizing the users.
In July of 2001, Portugal officially decriminalized all drugs. The punishment for being caught with anything from heroin to methamphetamines to marijuana became mandatory rehabilitation, or at worst, a small fine. No jail time. So what did Portugal's drug decriminalization actually do? Well, in the late 90s, Portugal was dealing with a serious drug problem. Rates of AIDS among drug addicts were higher than anywhere else in the European Union. Although there were fewer drug users overall, there was a much higher proportion of addicts among those users. Portugal's effort to reduce the harm caused by drugs through decriminalization had some interesting results. Despite hopes that the rates of addiction would fall, the Cato Institute noted that in the last decade and a half, drug use rates have actually stayed the same in Portugal. Many detractors feared that the country would become dependent on drug tourism, but that didn't happen either. Instead, Portugal has seen a significant decline in sexually transmitted disease, overdoses, and rates of HIV and AIDS. The clearest explanation for this shift is a combination of two forces: a governmental push toward treatment options instead of jail time for addicts, and a lack of stigma or punishment when seeking help for drug issues. This is known as harm reduction. That is, an acknowledgement and regulation of the problem rather than the usual practice of outlawing it, followed by punishment and jail time. Many have touted Portugal's experiment as a step towards the way we look at drug addiction, by stressing that it is a health issue, not a crime. Portugal's success with decriminalization may provide a framework on how to solve drug problems in other countries.